Welcome. Good evening, and welcome to our first Autism 200 of 2021. Tonight's topic is the state of autism in 2021, advocating for supports and services in Washington State. My name is Katrina Davis, and I'm a family advocate at the Seattle Children's Autism Center, and I'm a parent of a 21-year-old young man with autism. This presentation is being streamed via Facebook Live on Seattle Children's Facebook site. We welcome this large cyberspace audience tonight. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's presentation will be viewable online on Children's Facebook site and uploaded to our Autism 200 YouTube channel in the next few weeks. Thank you so much to our panelists tonight to live online for all eternity. And please keep this in mind tonight during the Q&A portion of the evening. Each year in January, we do this State of the State for Autism. 2020 was a tough year. The sudden loss of everything we knew, routines, predictability, individuals with autism and intellectual and developmental disability, or as you will hear tonight, IDD, lost access to vital therapies. The move to online education left behind a lot of students with special needs and disabilities. And the state floated cuts that would affect all levels of care and support, including job coaching, residential support, respite. Individuals with autism and IDD lost access to community participation, which wiped out opportunities for meaningful life activities. I can feel heads shaking all across the internet as I say this. Like I said, it was a really tough year. So what's ahead for 2021 in terms of services, supports, advocacy, state legislature, how we view disability in the world, and opportunities for inclusion? You tuned in tonight to know what's happening in our state, to learn how you can make a difference and the call to action, and how we get involved to influence change in our state. To help us wrap our head around this complex last year and what we can do moving forward, we have some amazing panelists with us tonight. We have Stacy Dim, the Executive Director from the ARC of Washington State. We have Jeremy Norton Paul, the Executive Director from the Developmental Disability Council. We have Ramona Hattendorf, Advocacy Director at the ARC of King County. And we have Adana Protonentis. She's a senior at Kindred Leaders and the mom of an autistic son, and she's also a parent member of the Developmental Disabilities Council. Stacy will lead the discussion tonight, and the panelists will take turns presenting, actually. We'll set aside some time at the end for Q&A, so please send questions to the comments or chat space. At the end, my colleague, who's a speech pathologist at the Autism Center at Children's, he will facilitate the Q&A. So thank you again for being here tonight, and Stacy, take it away.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here tonight. And thank you for finding respite and other caregiving to spend some time on you, hopefully, this evening, and to think about some exciting ways that you can make the world a better place for your children and for individuals with autism and developmental disabilities. I know the last several weeks have brought us a lot of anxiety and strife on top of COVID. And so I hope everybody can just take a breath this evening and just take in some of the interesting ideas and thoughts that we have to empower all of us. As Katrina mentioned, I'm Stacy Dim. I'm the Executive Director of the ARC of Washington State. I'm relatively new on the job. I'm rounding the corner on my 9th month in this position. But before this, I was the Executive Director of the ARC of King County, where Ramona is speaking to you from, for about 5 years. And then prior to that, I was the State Education Ombuds in the Governor's Office, and I worked in 2 other disability rights law firms. I'm also most proudly a sibling of someone with a developmental disability. And as such, my family's been engaged in advocacy since I can remember. Sometimes I think there isn't a difference between my personal and professional life. They're so intertwined. And I can imagine many of you feel that same way at times. Being the parent or the loved one of someone with autism or developmental disability makes you part of a cause, whether you've chosen it or you realize it or not. So So that'll be some of what we talk about tonight. If you could go to the next slide. I want to share some information about the ARC and give you just a little bit of history. The ARC was founded in 1936 right here in King County, and it was formed by parents whose children were institutionalized to raise awareness about their care and their need for an education and a meaningful life. The ARC has evolved in its thinking and its focus over the decades. It was influenced by the civil rights movement of the 60s and various laws in the 1970s that made access to public education, public benefits, Medicaid, and other community-based programs a reality across the United States. I'll only use this word once, but it is relevant to our conversation about the changes within the ARC and how we might support you as a parent and your children as they grow into adults. The ARC used to stand for the Association for Retarded Citizens, and an emphasis on the word citizens at that time. It was created to empower people with autism and developmental disabilities. And about 15 years ago, the ARC, as you can imagine, changed its name to remove the acronym and become focused solely on being a civil rights organization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The ARC for many years now has pioneered innovative programs, encouraged progressive governmental policies that promote independence and self-sufficiency and inclusion, always informing and educating society about the enduring potential and inherent value of people with autism and intellectual and developmental disabilities. So the ARC is now a national organization with a state office in every state, which is my role here in the state of Washington, and over 600 local chapters across the nation. Here in Washington state, there are about 9 local county-based chapters here in Washington. The ARC shapes national policy and provides needed specialized services in local communities throughout our state. Every ARC is its own 501c3, and it may look different in each community, but it often includes community residential supports, employment, supports for homelessness, most recently, IEP parent support, parent-to-parent peer support, and other programs that are hopefully culturally and linguistically responsive in all ways. The vision for the ARC is for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to be valued members of their communities and to the opportunity to realize their full potential and a future that is secure. Next slide, please. The ARC of Washington State has statewide services that are focused on advocacy, ensuring support for families and parents, and supporting individuals with autism and intellectual and developmental disabilities, who are often referred to as self-advocates. Our state in particular manages the State Endowment Trust Fund and does benefits counseling. We also provide some state training for individual parent providers for when their children turn 18. And we provide a great deal of advocacy. So we spend a lot of time, well, formerly in Olympia and now on Zoom, connecting with legislators and talking about the system and whether or not it meets the needs of our families and individuals. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk just for a minute about, and I won't spend long on this, the impact of COVID-19. And many of you are probably aware that COVID-19 has had a tremendous disproportionate impact on our families and on people with developmental disabilities. The rates of infection and people with developmental disabilities dying from COVID-19 on average is 2.5 times the general population. The infection rate is 3 to 4 times higher due to the need for care primarily from other people, other individuals who come into their homes, or people who may live in congregate care facilities or share staff. One of the most alarming is a recent statistic that people with Down syndrome are 10 times higher, more likely at risk for serious complications or death. So we have to take this very seriously in our community. We are moving into a vaccination phase. There are a lot of questions about the safety of the vaccination, how to get the vaccination, and whether or not people with autism and developmental disabilities are a priority for getting the vaccination. And so those are some of the conversations that we're in daily right now at this point. You'll hear more from Ramona and others about schools that are on remote schedules and the really devastating impact that has had on children with special healthcare needs, children with autism, children with developmental disabilities. And then in terms of DDA services, we know that many of our families are not receiving any services or supports. And even if they got them before the pandemic, it's very difficult to find in-person services for people with developmental disabilities and with autism. And that has created crisis for many families. So I want you to know that we're here for you. And those are some of the things that we can offer to you as the ARC. The next slide, please. And I just wanted to end really quickly with our parent-to-parent program, a program that has proven to be pretty essential during COVID-19 because of the level of isolation families and people with disabilities are experiencing. Parents of children with autism and IDD and other special healthcare needs by nature often become experts and can offer tremendous emotional support and information to other parents who are struggling and learning about coping with their child's disability or going through new stages and transitions for their child. I want to make sure that you know that in our state, we have 22 local programs across the state, and they have trained parent helpers whose parenting experiences may match what you're going through. And we know that research shows that talking to another parent who's really been there creates a very unique bond and empowers a struggling parent, improves family relationships, increases coping skills, and improves interactions with their children, reduces stress, and most importantly, might improve sleep, and improves often the mental health of a parent who may be feeling isolated and alone. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew about that. And I thank you tonight for the time that you're going to spend with the next speakers. Jeremy Norton Paul, who is the Executive Director of the Washington State Developmental Disabilities Council, is up next. And I'm very grateful to be able to introduce him. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy, so much. Like Stacy said, my name is Jeremy Norton Paul, and I'm the Executive Director of the Washington State Developmental Disabilities Council. We work very closely with Stacy and the ARC of Washington and other advocacy organizations across the state. And I want to tell you just a little bit about the DD Council tonight, but first, I just wanted the chance to introduce myself to those who I haven't yet had the privilege of meeting. I live in Tacoma with my wife and daughter. And we have lived here in Tacoma for about 1.5 years. We had previously lived in Seattle and then lived in Nashville, Tennessee for 5 years so that my wife could pursue her graduate studies. And everyone always told us that it would just be a matter of time before we got back to this part of the country. And we decided a couple years ago that it was time to make our way back, and here we are. And just a little bit about the experience that brings me to this particular space. I have my professional experience as an elementary special education teacher. I've served as a job coach and a job developer for folks with disabilities, advancing the employment first mission of our state and many other states. And most recently, before this role, I worked in Tennessee for the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, which is very similar to our state's DDA. And I was the State Director of Employment and Day Services. And so that's just a little bit about my professional background that brings me here. And I know that a lot of you might be familiar with the DD Council. Some of you might just know we exist, but you're not quite sure what we do. Some of you have been very involved in our work. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes going over who we are and what we do so that you can find ways to connect with us. Our mission is to advocate, promote, and implement policies and practices to create pathways to meaningful, integrated, and productive lives for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities over the life course. The key words there really being meaningful, integrated, and productive lives. And in a nutshell, our job is to help people with developmental disabilities live the lives that they want to live in the community and to support their families in that process. And we know that there are many individuals and organizations out there who, especially recently, have been talking about what it means to be committed to equity and to pursuing our work through an equity framework. And we by no means have it figured out. We are not the true experts yet, but we are committed to figuring out what that looks like in our planning and our programs and our daily practice. And so I wanted to share with you very clearly, very plainly, that our commitment to equity is that the DD Council is committed to operating through an equity framework to ensure that our work, everything we do, all of our programs, all of our policies and practices benefit people from all backgrounds and identities within the DD community. So that includes all sorts of different backgrounds and identities, but that includes things like race and ethnicity, language, gender identity, sexual orientation, geography, socioeconomic status, disability identity, service eligibility status, religion, citizenship status, and family composition. And we want to make sure that what we're doing benefits everyone within our community. Next slide, please. So what a lot of folks might not know about the DD Council is that we as a network across the country have been around since the 1960s. And our existence dates back to some of the early civil rights legislation coming out of the 1960s and some of the initiatives started by then President Kennedy. And we really got our start as a DD Council here in Washington in 1976, but there were other councils who got their start a little bit earlier before that. But we all trace our roots back to a federal law that is now known as the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act of 2000. And we usually just call it the DD Act for short. And if you go and read that, it actually sets a pretty amazing framework for why we do what we do and what we focus on around capacity building and advocacy and systems change. As I mentioned, there is a DD Council in every single state and territory across the country, including Washington, D.C. and the territories. So there are 56 of us total. We all look and act a little differently, but we all have the same underpinning. We're all committed to that same mission of helping people live their lives in the community. So we are federally funded, and that funding formula is based on a whole set of criteria like size of the state and population, poverty rates, and other things like that. And like I said, we're really focused around improving people's lives in 3 areas: systems change, individual and family advocacy, and capacity building. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more about how we exist within Washington, alongside all of our other peers across the country. Governor Dan Evans signed an executive order in 1976 establishing us as a council. Back then, we were called the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, and we've changed our name over the years. And every so often, governors will reissue an executive order reaffirming our existence and reaffirming our dedication to our mission. And that most recently happened in 2016 under Governor Jay Inslee. Didn't just change the name, but just made it very clear who we are and what we do. Some of you might know that 60% of our members, at least 60%, need to be citizen members or public members, meaning that they're people with developmental disabilities and parents, guardians, or family members of people with developmental disabilities. And the rest of the members are agency representatives and other partners within the state as specified by our federal law. Next slide. So that was a lot of words. And I want you to know, if you walk away with knowing nothing else about the DD Council and what we do, I want you to remember this, that we help make the system work better for people with developmental disabilities and their families. At a state level, we try to figure out what the problems are, what the challenges are, what the barriers are, and we figure out what the levers that we have to pull, what the buttons we have to push, and what kind of advocacy and training we need to do to make a change and make a difference. And so I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the DD Council. I'm really looking forward to the presentations from Ramona and Adana. As you've heard, Adana is one of our newest council members, and she is just a tremendous addition to our group. And I did see a question in the chat box, but I will maybe save that until a little bit later unless someone would like me to address it now. So Lenny or anyone else, do you want me to just go ahead and answer that now? Okay, I'll do that. So real quickly, the question is a great one. What's the difference between DDC and DDA? Excellent question. We get mixed up all the time. DDA stands for the Developmental Disabilities Administration, and it's part of a state agency called the Department of Social and Health Services. And the biggest difference is that DDA provides services to people. They provide supported living services and other residential supports, employment services, community access services. The DDC, we do not provide any direct services to people. We're an advocacy organization. We certainly partner with DDA and we work together, but our job is to help hold them accountable and to help make sure that the system is working as well as it can, not just with DDA, but all the other state agencies too. So I hope that answers your question. All right. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ramona, who's going to give us a presentation.
Hi, good evening. So I'm Ramona Hattendorf. It's been quite a year, and many of us are reeling. I'm the Director of Advocacy at the ARC of King County, and as Stacy said, we work with people with developmental disabilities. We protect and promote their rights, their civil rights that are on the books, and the human rights that we want to be on the books. And we advocate for inclusion. At the ARC of King County, we do a mix of several things. We have direct support professionals. We have a supported living program and representative payee. We do a lot of navigation. We have many social workers on our staff. And then we also do some advocacy support, and that is through civic engagement and basic education about what the different policies are and how they're affecting life. So tonight I want to back up a little bit, and I want to give a framework for advocacy that hopefully you'll find meaningful. Here's a slice, it's part of the framework, a slice of what we've been grappling with just in the pandemic. But I want to emphasize, we're seeing this in the pandemic, but this is something that we actually deal with pre-pandemic. And it's something that we're going to continue to live with post-pandemic. So it's really something that we need to change. And that's honestly what my job is. My job is to help people figure out how to transform things. So, big one, kids were shut out of education. When kids moved online, they didn't lead with access inclusion, they being the school leaders. They tried to circle back much later, but weaknesses in the system have become barriers, and sometimes they were insurmountable. Next, please. Families were left shaken. Therapy is essential to develop and retain critical skills. When services changed or stopped altogether, life skills took a hit. When people suddenly found themselves isolated and unable to participate in their community, mental health took a hit. When providers couldn't be present in the way families needed them to be, quality of life took a hit. Next slide, please. We also had a gut-wrenching scare. Washington cuts it really close when it comes to budgeting for people with developmental disabilities. We fall in the bottom 10 for funding for the DDA supports. These are supports that are paid through Medicaid. When sales tax plummeted this summer, cost-saving proposals were floated. The governor asked all the agencies to figure out what would it look like if we had to cut 50%. The Developmental Disability Administration and also the Aging and Long-Term Supports Administration, they came up with a number of potential cuts, but the big one, the one that covered the 85% of the cuts proposed, was to change eligibility standards. So some people who would get supports would no longer be eligible and they would lose them. They ran models, and the models showed about 1 in 3 of the DDA community clients losing all support. So a third, more than a third of people would go from having the supports they need to live in the community, participate, to hold down jobs, to have a home, would lose everything. And that is really frightening. That's what happened when they modeled a 15% cut. And part of that is because DDA is a Medicaid service, which means a lot of the funding is actually matching federal funding. So that 15% was really a 30% cut. And I also wanted to really emphasize that some of those cuts were housing. Some people who are in adult family homes, if they lost their eligibility, they would have lost their house. So this was really, really scary. Next slide, please. So the work ahead is around equity, access, and inclusion. As we've moved through these photos, I'm going to ask you to think about what you see and what do they have in common. Next slide, please. Next. And next. So have you guessed? Next slide, please. In addition to a lot of smiling, they have a sense of belonging. Belonging is critical. Belonging is about inclusion. Next slide, please. It is beautiful when we witness it and we experience it. Next slide, please. But in Washington State, we had a massive intergenerational fail when it comes to inclusion and belonging. We see this failure in how we choose to educate our children. And by we, I'm talking about the state as a whole, not necessarily individuals as families. We see this in who the homeless are. We see it affecting children at a very young age. It is intergenerational because when kids grow up in separate settings, it limits us. They lose out on belonging. Classmates lose out by not knowing each other. They grow up thinking children with disabilities should be separate. As adults, we normalize this. As a state, we are a state that separates children. And then we try to learn how to get out of that as adults, and it doesn't work very well. Next slide, please. And we all lose out because of this. Inclusion is incredibly important from the start. Children seek to belong. They learn to connect socially from very early in life. Early inclusion promotes continued social connection and community. Early isolation predicts longer-term isolation. About 6 years ago, the nation embarked on a huge push for inclusive early learning. It came from the U.S. Departments of Education and Health and Human Services. They laid out the research, they laid out the law, they suggested policy, they offered training. They followed up 2 years later with even more pointers about the law. Next slide, please. The internet must have been down in Washington because the word didn't seem to get to this corner of the US. We do not see a statewide commitment to ensuring inclusion for our youngest. It's not there. Next slide, please. This slide shows specifically children with disabilities ages 3 to 5. So these are our preschoolers. And if you can observe, on the far left are the regular program. A regular program in early learning is a classroom where children with and without disabilities are learning alongside each other. And at least 50% of the children do not have disabilities. And so this on the far left shows a regular classroom with what sometimes are called push-in supports. So kids are getting most of their specialized instruction and most of the related supports in that general education environment. The gray bar is the national average. The blue bar is Seattle, and the orange bar is the state. We don't do a whole lot with the most inclusive or least restricted environment. On the two on the far right are segregated classrooms, and then another provider location. Sometimes people don't necessarily enroll in the preschool program, they just get related services. So a segregated class is like almost a mirror image of that first one. The blue bar is Seattle. Seattle educates way more than half of their kids in separate classrooms. And then comes the orange bar, and that's the state, and then the gray bar, and that's the federal government. I mean, I'm sorry, that's the national average. So you can see we're not in line with the rest of the nation. In fact, we're the 5th most segregated and the 3rd least inclusive in the nation. This is for preschoolers. Just 1 in 5 preschoolers with IEPs learn in a regular class in our state. The state's also the 3rd least inclusive for early learners with IEPs. And this continues into K-12. In K-12, we're the 6th lowest in the nation for inclusion. We're the 4th for students with disabilities who are also English learners, and we're 3rd lowest in the nation for students with intellectual disabilities. We're not inclusive. Next slide, please. Here's a sampling, and it's just a random sampling. This is not the best or the worst. I was teaching a class at the time, and I just pulled some samples of people who happen to be in the class, their school districts. But here's a sampling of how this preschool exclusion plays out locally. So each of these sets of bars is a different school. The blue bar is the most inclusive setting or the least restricted environment, and that's the regular class with push-in supports. And then the separate class is the gray bar. And if you look at this, you can see it really varies dramatically depending on the school district. Federal Way and Auburn have very tall blue bars. Lake Washington, Seattle, not so much big blue bars. They've got big gray bars. So we can see not only as a state, are we not inclusive, we can see how erratic and inconsistent this is at the local level. Some districts clearly value inclusion and others do not. 6 years after this big federal push, Washington remains an outlier. We continue to separate children, and we start doing it pretty much from the get-go in preschool. Next slide, please. And this one's actually very disturbing for a lot of people. Here's how segregation and exclusion plays out through removal. In case you didn't know, more children are suspended or expelled in their preschool years than they actually are in their K-12 years. And it turns out the children most likely to be suspended or removed are the children with disabilities. In fact, 75% of the removals are of children with disabilities, even though they only make up 12% of this preschool population. What this study here reflects is they looked at both formal and informal. So those of you who are parents of young children or older, you might remember if you've gotten calls, please come pick up your child, or perhaps you said, you know, the setting, it's really, I don't think we're the best setting for your child. Maybe they would be better served somewhere else. Some of these are informal, and some of them are the child is told that they can't come back. And sometimes that happens suddenly. Many of these children are also Black, Indigenous, and children of color. This is who we're removing. This study, by the way, was from the Center for the American Progress. And it's very interesting to me in how it breaks down. I never would have guessed that so many children with a speech disorder would be removed. Next slide, please. I want to emphasize this. Inclusion is a decision. You decide to include. And if it's absent, it means that people are okay with that. Someone, somewhere with power and influence is okay with that. Next slide, please. And this problem, this is a situation that's way bigger than preschool or even K-12. Washington actually does a pretty good job with long-term supports, but, not long-term supports specific to people with disabilities. For intellectual and developmental disability long-term supports, we're in the bottom 10 on what are called waiver fundings. These are Medicaid long-term supports designed specifically to support people with developmental disabilities so they can participate and live in their community. And we're in the bottom 10 for this. Based on prevalence and census data, we should expect that there should be about 120,000 people in the state who need this level of care, but only about 35,000 people get it. Another way to look at it is that between 1% and 2% of the population needs this level of care, this waiver level of care. In our state, we offer it less than 0.5% of the population. So a pretty small number to start with needs this level of support, 1% to 2%, and we can't even get to 1%. We're 41st again in spending for these supports. 41st, by the way, that number varies depending what exactly you're measuring. If you're measuring just the specific waiver supports, we're 41st. We bump up a little bit if you factor in personal care. We tend to put a little bit more money into our personal care. And that's also personal care for those of you who are in the weeds with these services. Those are entitlement services, meaning that if you qualify, you're going to get those services. The waivers that the Developmental Disability Administration works with, those are not. Those are whatever the state decides to invest in. And the state has decided to cap them and has somewhat intentionally decided that we cannot, we will not, whatever the rationale was, they are not fully funding. They're not funding everyone. Thousands, 14,000 have been found eligible and they're sitting on a wait list right now. Next slide, please. We also see an economic instability. People are twice as likely to live in poverty if they have a disability. And that's because they're earning a lot less. They're earning about a third less, and that's across all disability. For certain disabilities, that becomes much higher. And we see that because both they tend to have much lower salaries with lower earnings, and also because they tend to work less than full-time. If you're not aware, King County's homeless population, which has been increasing for the chronically homeless segment, chronically homeless is something specific that you have a disability, that's part of the definition, and you also have, you're repeatedly homeless or you're homeless for long periods of time. So every year they do a count. And in 2019, 64% of the homeless in King County had some form of disability. And that was up from 53 in 2018. And that was up from 50% the year prior. So homelessness and disability are linked. Homelessness and housing stability is very much a disability issue. And yet, the policies around housing and homelessness really don't touch on disability. National research says between 30 and 40% of the people living in homelessness have a cognitive disability. And I don't see a lot of policy proposals specific to disability and housing. Next slide, please. So, this is the case, and I'm sorry, I'm always the person who brings people down, which is why I put in some photos. As a state, we don't embrace diversity, and in fact, we marginalize. We especially marginalize by race and disability, and we super marginalize when those intersect with each other. Next slide, please. We see this across people's lives, how they fare in school, their access to healthcare, their interactions with law enforcement, suicide rates, homelessness. The data is pretty alarming. Next slide, please. But you don't find a lot of that information on the accountability dashboards. A lot of schools, counties, state agencies, they have dashboards that they put together, and they do it for accountability. They're very, very informative. But unfortunately, a lot of it is not something that touches on what we call intersectionality. So for instance, they might have a racial breakdown of, say, the homeless population, but they don't have the ability to disaggregate that with disability status or vice versa. And that means that they only have a limited vision of what is actually happening to the citizens. Next slide, please. The failure to include is stamped all over public policy, and who and what our government chooses to invest in, keep safe, and offer opportunity to. Next slide, please. Inclusion and belonging, these are not neutral concepts. It's not enough to just say maybe next year. Personal well-being and public health depend on it. It turns out that the brain is highly dependent on relationship. People need to belong. They need to participate. And when they don't, their health takes a dive. Next slide, please. I want to go back to this slide and just have a moment to look at it again and observe it. I want to emphasize how inconsistent and perhaps arbitrary your chance or your child's chance for inclusion can be. We want to see blue. We want to see a lot of blue all over this. Who has it? Who doesn't? Who made those decisions and why? Next slide, please. There are policy decisions that were made by elected leaders to exclude or segregate. And I say that affirmatively because failure to act is still a decision. They may not have voted, I'm going to not include that child, but by looking at the data and by choosing not to act on it, that's still a decision. Next slide, please. Individuals who work in the system opted not to practice inclusion. Next slide, please. In school settings, research shows it's attitude, not funding or professional capacity, that is the biggest barrier to inclusion. And we have tangible benefits when inclusion and belonging are present. Next slide, please. Inclusion does not just happen. Inclusionary practices are grounded in social and emotional learning and relationship development, but also there's disability awareness. There is commitment to accessibility. And also, there needs to be awareness of racial and other bias and cultural competence. Inclusive practices are really about system transformation. Next slide, please. So how can you get involved? If you prefer to keep it local, you can call your school board member. You can ask them, do you know what the least restricted environment You can ask if they'll work with you to increase it, or at least talk to you to understand why you think that might be and what they can do to make it different. If you are ready and willing to act at the state level, there's a link there, ledge.wa.gov. You can look up your legislators. You can call them, you can set up meetings with them, or you can just send them an email. You can write to them. Ask them what their vision is. Do they have bills? The big things this year, they're going to be doing a budget. They're going to be doing a 2-year budget. And when we went into it over the summer, we were looking at big cuts. Now it looks like we've moved from a dire situation to a challenging situation, but it's still a very challenging situation, especially considering some of the other investments that legislators are weighing. They're trying to decide how can they use, in a time when a lot of people are struggling, how can they best use the money to raise everybody up? And the DD supports in there are something that aren't entitlement. It's not something that they have to pay. There's something that are really very cuttable. Not cuttable morally or cuttable they want to cut them, but they're cuttable because there aren't a lot of restrictions against cutting them. So the budget is going to be huge. Next slide. Oh, we're on the next slide, please. Also, equity, economic recovery, and COVID-19. These are the themes that a lot of legislators have basically taken a pledge that this is what they're going to focus on. So I would just encourage you to personally also keep an equity lens. If you are engaging, take time to remember and take time to heart that racial disparities we see in education and health. Any disturbing data point you see about disability is magnified when it intersects with race. Make sure you're leaving space for other voices, but do show up. There are some bills to watch for. One's called the Fair Start Act, and this is going to be around investments in early learning and childcare. There's a hearing today, another hearing tomorrow. It would really put some investments in some key places, and we just want to make sure, is inclusion in there? Are you remembering that children with disabilities also use childcare? Are you remembering that parents of children with disabilities struggle mightily to find stable childcare? What are you doing around that? That's going to be a big bill for a lot of families. Another one is there's perhaps going to be an effort to bring in what's called a Katie Beckett waiver to Washington. And this would ensure children with complex healthcare needs have access to coverage by allowing families to buy into Medicaid. Not everybody automatically qualifies for Medicaid, and healthcare can be extremely expensive if your child has complex health needs. We're also looking for investments in housing, technical support for schools to implement what are called multi-tiered supports. We're also looking to have school staff continue to build their inclusive practices. As I said before, lack of inclusion, it's not neutral. Lost opportunity and alienation, that's what happens when you have lack of opportunity, when you have lack of inclusion. And those are harmful. Membership and participation are essential to building relationships and critical life skills. Next slide, please. So the first step in advocacy is being present and being aware. Then comes participation, and then meaningful involvement. You're going to want to find your people. They'll be your support. They'll bring flags. They'll be your support. They'll flag bills for you. They'll find issues for you to talk about. Find your people. And by that, the ARC's a great place. The DD Council. There's actually a lot of really great organizations out there. There's organizations like SAIL and People First for people with disabilities themselves. There's a lot of people out there, so find your people. Your advocacy does not have to be legislative, but if you want to change public policies and budgets, then you're going to have to actually talk to elected leaders, because public policy, budgets, state budgets, they're the ones who enact that. They're the ones who make and change policy. Your school staff, your agency workers, they don't make policy. Their job is to implement to the best of their ability. The change comes from the elected leaders. And so to get change, you're going to have to help those elected leaders see that there's a problem. You're going to have to help them get to the point where they agree change is needed. Seeing a problem and agreeing to change are two different things. And it takes time to help move a person from seeing it to wanting to change. And then you have to make sure they agree on what the change will be and how will they implement it. Advocacy all along the way. There's a lot to do in Washington around inclusion and belonging. But the payoff is worth it. Next slide. The impact is lifelong. Next slide. And belonging really matters. And that's all I have. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ramona. That was amazing. I think I had a slide before this one, actually. That one, yes. Thank you so much. All right, good evening, y'all. It is such a delight and just honor and privilege to follow those three courageous, committed, and just plain kind humans. And I'm after Ramona, especially, I'm feeling fired up. So I hope you got your church hats because I'm ready to preach at you for a while. I want to talk a little bit also about belonging. You know, belonging is about connection. I want to speak about connectedness and interdependency. And that's because if the events of the last 12 months have taught us nothing else, it should be how interconnected we are and how powerfully our choices can impact our communities. And so I want to start by introducing myself. I'm Dana. I am a mom of two. My son, Langston, is 10 and a half, you want me to tell you, and he's autistic and has a couple of other co-occurring conditions. My littlest, Aurelia, just turned 9. I work as an equity consultant, and I'm also a new member to the Developmental Disabilities Council. And I want to bring into the room, the virtual room, I want to just call the names of the folks who make it possible for me to be here today in the spirit of belonging and connectedness. I want to name my husband, Orion, who is working very hard right now to keep our kids happy and occupied so that I can be present without distraction. I want to acknowledge the healthcare workers and the essential frontline workers who are working so hard to keep us safe from this pandemic. They make it safe and they make it possible for us to be here too. May I have the next slide, please? I want to acknowledge the people around the world. Actually, let's go back. It's the trees. Somehow they got swapped. I don't know why. I want to acknowledge the people around the world who made our computers and the textile workers who made our clothes and the carpenters who built our furniture and all the others who do the labor that allows us to be here in relative safety and comfort. I want to acknowledge and honor the Native communities on whose land I'm sitting right this moment. So for me, that would be the Coast Salish peoples. And I want to acknowledge that it's their occupation and genocide that also makes it possible for us to be here today, because we exist in context. Everything that came before us, the resilience, the innovation, the enslavement, the oppression, the resistance, the curiosity, and the courage, it is all part of our story. Just like those trees, which from the surface look like they're just a series of individuals, but underneath they're all deeply interconnected with each other and with history. Next slide, to the cute little boy. I especially want to acknowledge and honor the many members of the disability community and specifically the autism community who have so generously and patiently over the years shared their wisdom with me and taught me about advocacy and inclusion and belonging. I want to especially acknowledge and name my son Langston, who is my most patient teacher and gave me one heck of a pep talk before this, actually, and a kiss for good luck. So it's gonna go very smoothly. And I do all of this. I name all of these people. And I invite you to do the same, to think about these connections as they exist for yourselves. If you picture that arc of the rocks and how they're all like using dynamic tension to keep each other upright. I do all of that because I want us to move away from this very individualized vision of the world and towards something that's more communal and collective. Because I didn't get here alone, and I'm willing to bet you didn't either. And I didn't learn these lessons that I've learned alone. And I stand on the shoulders of many. And I hope one day there are folks that are going to stand on my shoulders too, because that's how this works. Because when we talk about belonging, at least when I talk about belonging, I mean belonging to as much as I mean belonging with. When we belong to each other, we move away from thinking about the individual and toward collectivism, toward community, toward common unity. To borrow a brilliant question from the poet Elizabeth Alexander, are we not of interest to each other? And if we are of interest to each other, we can use that interest to move away from the scarcity mindset that we're peddled day after day after day, the one that keeps us so focused on our own struggles and tricks us into believing that there isn't enough justice to go around. It tells us that there aren't enough services, there aren't enough seats in inclusive classrooms, there aren't enough funds for programs. It is simply not true. It's a question of priorities. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what is true. Ramona just gave us a whole lot of truth. She told us about how advocacy is essential for creating the inclusive, belonging world that our babies deserve. But then here's the question, who is responsible for that? Who is it that should be advocating? And that answer is you should. Our systems often make us believe that there are only some voices that matter, that you have to know the right people, you have to have the right credentials, you have to have the right series of letters after your name, you have to have a lot of money. You end up feeling unqualified to advocate. But you are qualified because of your life experience. Sometimes I do this I gave myself this trick to use when I'm in the presence of a new provider and I feel intimidated by them or they make me feel small. I often like to say, you know, it's awesome that you have like an MD and a PhD in neuropsychiatry or whatever the heck it is at the moment. That's cool. It's really cool. Honestly, I do believe that. I have my own expertise. I have a doctorate in my child. And I think that between the two of us, we're going to be able to do something really incredible, provided that we value each other's expertise equally. There's a lot of power in that. You're also qualified because you have a story to tell. And that's really what advocacy is about. It's storytelling. And stories are powerful. Stories are magical. Stories are tools for liberation. Stories can take these issues that lawmakers and decision makers are grappling with, and it can bring them to life. It can take something that's theoretical and make it real and make it tangible. I'll tell you a story. There was an issue in Olympia, I think 3 years ago, about insurance pre-authorization. Talk about boring. Regents was doing this thing where they were making you get pre-authorization before you could have visits for occupational therapy and speech therapy. And the OT union, or so the OT lobby was just not getting anywhere with trying to get some traction on legislation to try to get that practice to stop. And my occupational therapist asked if my son and I would go testify about it. I'm like, sure, yeah, absolutely. So I took Langston down to Olympia and we sat down and we just told our story. Because before our testimony, it was just a dispute between insurance companies and providers. It was dry, it was boring, it was all about numbers. And then here was this little 7-8-year-old kid who sat down and talked about how much he loves his occupational therapist and how she's helping him so much with handwriting and with his sensory challenges and how hard it is when he doesn't get to see her and that he really needs to be able to see her consistently so that he can keep growing and learning and building these new skills. Next slide, please. And then this happened. And I'm not going to say it was all because of our story, but I mean, Langston is kind of impressive. So I think it was Langston. It was all Langston. But that's the power of story. And that's really the essence of advocacy. Our stories can also be used to challenge assumptions about what equity means and about what inclusion means and about what justice is and about who belongs. Because remember, just like Ramona was saying, a lot of us grew up in segregated schools. I sure did. We grow up socialized into expecting disabled people to be out of sight, to be invisible, to not see them, to not notice them. We learn to not look for them in common spaces. And the professionals in our lives also grew up in that same environment. And so it's up to us to challenge those underlying assumptions. Stories make our families visible, and there is no one who can tell your story like you do. And I firmly believe that Ta-Nehisi Coates was right when he said we get to the general through the specific. Our specific stories help these decision makers, these school administrators, hospital administrators, lawmakers, all of these people really understand that these theoretical issues, these numbers on paper, are people in their neighborhoods with stories and lives that matter. So that's who should advocate. It's you. You're on the hook for it now. But how? How should we do it? Next slide, please. We should practice inclusive advocacy. Let's think back to that idea of interconnectedness, right? Because none of us are here alone. And none of us are here accidentally. We're all here because of a shared connection, because we all have a connection to autism. And the beautiful and fascinating thing about autism is that it is so inclusive. As my son has actually told me before, anyone can be autistic. He actually told me if I work really hard, I might be able to be autistic too. May I see the next slide? Talk about diversity. So when we're advocating, we need to think about our community, our autism community, in an inclusive way and bring that into our advocacy. And there's a tool that we can use to help us. Ramona referenced it earlier. I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper. It's called Intersectionality. So intersectionality is a tool that helps us better understand barriers, honestly. It's a way of understanding the relationship between identity and power. It was created by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1988. And in that instance, she was trying to find a way to explain how it could be true that we have a feminist movement, like a mainstream feminist movement, and yet Black women feel invisible in it and like their needs aren't met. And what is it about the combination of race and gender in that regard that's creating this very, very difficult set of circumstances? So she created this framework for us to use to try to understand those things. It's really a tool for noticing how different kinds of privilege and marginalization can interact and amplify each other. So we all are like this person, the little stick figure in the middle. This is like the extent of my art skills right here. This is about as good as it gets. And we all have a race, a class, a language, a culture, an ethnicity, a gender, an education, etc. And there are various levels of power and privilege or oppression or marginalization that are attached to each one of those things. And that unique combination is what makes your lived experience what it is. And when we reduce people to just a single version of themselves, we miss the fullness of who they are. You know, when my son was diagnosed, based on the images that I saw in media, in brochures and pamphlets, I would have assumed that all autistic people were white and male and that most of them were children. Next slide, please. I didn't see girls. I didn't see people of color. I didn't see elders. I didn't see trans folks. I didn't see non-binary folks. And the danger here is erasure. That erases a huge part of our community. I couldn't see my family anywhere, and that made everything so much harder. And honestly, it's why I got involved in advocacy in the first place. It's that no one was telling my story. I couldn't see a reflection of our experience anywhere. So I had to do it myself. So why does this matter? It matters because all oppression is connected. It also matters because we can't have belonging if we can't see each other, really see each other, see the fullness of each other's identities and lived experiences. I can't tell you how many times I've been in an autism support group, like social media autism moms group, a community-based organization that's centered on autism. And I try to talk about something related to my life and my family and our understanding, our experience with autism. And I'm told, we're not talking about race today. We're just talking about autism. But there's no way for me to separate these. And spoiler alert, autistic people can be people of color. Autistic people, literally anyone can be autistic, right? So we can't separate these things. To be able to care for our entire community, to really foster belonging and nurturing, we have to talk about gender. We have to talk about race. We have to talk about age and class and ethnicity and language of origin and on and on and on, because it's all connected. For our advocacy to be truly disability inclusive, because disability is so diverse, we have to learn about the ways that discrimination against disabled people or ableism is connected to other forms of oppression like racism and misogyny. Or as Audre Lorde said on the next slide, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Intersectionality is a tool that helps us understand injustice so that we can push back effectively, so that we can develop strategies that are actually going to do the job. One of my favorite strategies is a very simple question. I ask, which people? So for example, we're facing a challenge, we're advocating for services in schools, accommodations in the hospital, support in the community. I go back to thinking about that stick figure. I go back to thinking about where I have power and where I don't. I get curious about how things are working for folks who don't have my resources and curious about how can I include them in my advocacy? How can I leverage my seat at the table in service of this community? How many people can I bring with me? Next slide, please. When we talk about school discipline and disparities in school discipline and how kids with disabilities are terribly, terribly treated in schools with regard to school discipline. We need to ask the question, which students with disabilities? Is it all of them? Are they all treated equally? Is it all the same? I have a hunch that it isn't. This data on the screen right now, and I'm gonna ask for your grace because numbers are not something I'm that comfortable with all the time, but I'm gonna be brave today. This data is from the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights at the federal level. And I pulled data on Seattle Public Schools, not to pick on them, but simply because it's the biggest district in the state. And over here on the left, we've got that little teal pie chart, teal and purple. And the teal part is general ed students enrollment, and the purple part is special education students. And we're looking specifically at in-school suspensions. So for general education students, I'm seeing, or sorry, for special education students, I'm seeing that 14.8% of special education students are 14.8% of the school, and gen ed students are 85. If we look at in-school suspensions, we see that special education students are 41% of the suspensions. So definitely a disparity there. Our special ed students are definitely overrepresented when it comes to in-school suspensions. But let's ask our question, which special education students? Next slide, please. So on the left, we're looking at special ed enrollment by race. We see that about 42% of the special ed students are white. We see that about 20% of the students are Black. We see that 1.1% are American Indian or Alaska Native, and so on and so forth. Let's look at in-school suspensions again. Oh my goodness, I see that white students, even though they're 42% of special ed students in Seattle Public Schools, they are not 42% of the kids who are getting suspended. Black students are 47% of the kids with IEPs who are getting suspended. So that question again about which students with disabilities need our attention. Next slide, please. And we see these numbers mirrored when we look at out-of-school suspensions on the left and expulsions on the right. Again and again and again, we're seeing the reproduction of what happens when race and disability intersect. Next slide. This is the one that keeps me up at night. Referrals to law enforcement. So remember, American Indian and Alaska Native students are only 1.1% of the population, but they're 7.7% of the kids being referred to law enforcement out of special ed. Black students, 40% of the kids being referred to law enforcement out of special ed. Next slide, please. This is the beginning of the school to prison pipeline, folks. This is it. African American students with disabilities represent 18.7% of the special ed population, nationally speaking, and 49.9% of special education students in correctional facilities. That's from the National Council on Disability in 2015. Next slide, please. But it doesn't just stop with education, it's also healthcare. Next slide. This is a pretty recent study that was published in the Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics that says that the data show that there's a 3-year lag between when parents first notice a developmental delay and when they actually get an autism diagnosis, if it's an African American family. There are similar delays for Latinx families. There are not these delays for white and Asian families. So again, which kids? And then this one, disparities in service use. What does the data show? The data shows that families and children are encountering race, ethnicity, and income-based service disparities. Families of color, lower income families report less access to services, lower quality of services, and higher unmet service needs than their white, higher resource counterparts. Next slide. And what causes that anyway? Right, these are the questions that I like to add. I like to ask the really, really uncomfortable questions for folks. And some of it, I think, is going to be on this next slide here. Can we be brave enough to use the big words that make us feel scared? In our inclusive advocacy, can we be brave enough to call out racism when we see it? I got to tell you, I actually did a presentation. I did an equity training for mental health providers who serve autistic kids. Far north of Seattle, not that long ago, and I presented this data. And I asked the question, why do you think this data exists? Why do you think this is the case? What do you think is the problem? And every answer in the room was to blame the parents. It was, they don't know what to look for. The parents aren't very well educated. They're not very good advocates. They don't know where to get services. It was all their fault. No one came out and said, it's racism. It's just racism. It is. And we need to stop pretending that it's anything else. We need to stop pretending that there isn't racism in our hospitals and in our schools and in our legislatures. It's everywhere. So instead of asking the question, well, is it here or not, we can skip that part and we can just go to, when we see it, what are we going to do about it? And when we talk about inclusive advocacy, what we're going to do about it is we're going to say, hey, next time I'm seeing my provider, I'm like, this really intense woman named Dana gave this big presentation and was talking about disability and health, or disability and racism in healthcare. And I was curious, what actions are you taking in your clinic to be anti-racist? What does that look like? I'd love to learn. I'm really curious. Please tell me. Can we be that brave and bold? Next slide, please. The truth of the matter is, inclusive advocacy is just more effective. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. It's about building more connections, stronger coalitions, and really tending to our entire community. There is great power in that. That idea that I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. That I belong to this beautiful, incredibly diverse community, and I'm here to make sure that I do right by all of them. Because honestly, silos don't work. Trickle-down social justice isn't justice. Starting at the top and hoping that things work out along the way is just doomed to fail. If we only achieve inclusion for autistic boys and we leave girls behind, our work isn't done. If we only achieve inclusion for white autistic students and we leave kids of color behind, our work isn't done. Why? Because it leaves the system intact. It doesn't transform the system. The same system that was hurting my kid, I just found a way to keep my kids safe from harm, and I left everybody else in the jaws of the beast. That's not inclusive advocacy. That's not what you do when you belong to a community as much as you belong with a community. But what if we started the other way around? What if we started by asking who's most marginalized in this community? Who's experiencing the worst outcomes? And can I center them? Can I be of service to them? Can I dismantle all the stuff that's getting in their way so that they are thriving? I think that would be kind of amazing. Honestly, the best and most effective advocates that I know and admire are people who seek connection across difference. They keep sight of that long list of people who make our work possible. All those folks I was naming in the beginning of this talk, and so many more that I didn't have time to bring into this space with us. They belong to and with. They use tools like intersectionality to better understand our struggles and to create innovative and inclusive solutions that really get at our problems, that really see that sometimes, like with the school to prison pipeline, it's not a race problem and it's not a disability problem, it's both. They reject that scarcity mindset that says that we can have racial justice or disability justice, but we can't have both at the same time. Reject that idea that gender justice has to wait until later, because the truth of the matter is the diversity of our community demands that we address all of it. We can and we should and we must do it all because we belong to this beautiful, complex, stunningly diverse group of people, and they deserve it. We have to be committed to a type of progress that includes all of us and leaves no one behind. So yes, you should be an advocate. You should be an advocate because you believe in inclusion and belonging and because you have a story to tell. And you should be an inclusive advocate because you belong to me and I belong to you. And because when I'm out there saying our kids deserve services and support and inclusion and belonging, I'm talking about your kid. When I say our kid, I mean your kid too. We are complicit in each other's well-being. MLK says justice is what love looks like in public. And we're in this together. And if we want a community of love and belonging, we have to fight for justice for all of us. All right, that's enough out of me. Thank you.
Well, it's amazing. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Ramona. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm Jim Mancini. I'm taking over for Katrina, who you might have noticed was having a lag in her from her picture to her voice. So I'm going to be the one that's taking questions and going going to start with a question that was really, right at the beginning from Elsa. And Elsa asked, do we have any data of people with autism, not necessarily Down syndrome, that are dying from COVID? So it's a COVID-related question. In other words, is it proven that having autism puts individuals at a higher risk of dying from COVID? So not sure who wants to take that one. I was thinking Stacy, but I'll let anyone else take that if they like it.
Well, Jim, you guys are the medical experts, and I would say that you probably have a few more studies that are coming in. But what we do know is that for people with underlying conditions, and many people with autism have underlying conditions, they are at much greater risk. I think I've seen some studies that demonstrate that some of the genetics that might be involved in autism could be an indicator that some people with autism could have more significant and severe reactions and higher risk. I have not seen a statistic that, that I've seen through children's or that I consider to be a very super reliable number, particularly from the CDC. But we also know that just in terms of the general adult population for people with autism, because of sensory issues, wearing a mask is very difficult, complying with hand washing and the kinds of precautions that we know prevent COVID and reduce the risk are also very difficult for people with autism. And so I think logic would tell us, if nothing else, that this is a higher risk situation.
Yeah, I would agree with all those. That's what we're thinking at, hearing about at the Seattle Children's Autism Center. Okay, next question is a question related to crisis services. Crisis services are almost non-existent for our DDA enrolled population. What is being done and what can we do to make an impact?
I'm happy to start on that one and let other people join in. So every year in Olympia, through the legislature, we fight for additional crisis beds, primarily for individuals with autism, for children and for adults, because we know that people go into behavioral crisis. We've also talked quite a bit about better crisis stabilization through various programs in our state that are already available. And it's a critical need. Unfortunately, we tend to get 1 or 2 or 3 places each year that may help with this gap in services, and it's never enough. We know that crisis intervention in the community is very different based on the community that you live in, and that for individuals with autism in particular, the danger and escalation around police involvement is very alarming, and that we have got to work carefully as we look at police reform and we look at general crisis intervention in the community, that there are some really good discussions around the needs of children, adolescents, youth, and adults with autism.
Thank you, Stacy. Jeremy, Dana, Ramona, anyone want to add to what Stacy said about crisis supports?
This is Jeremy. I would just emphasize what Stacy said at the beginning of her response, which is advocate. And I know that, like Ramona and Adana were saying, that can be a scary, intimidating thing. But really, it comes down to sharing your story and your experience in a way that people making important decisions about money really get it. Not just on paper, not just statistics, but really understand, oh my gosh, I can visualize how that affects you and your family. And so just emphasizing the importance of finding a way to advocate. It doesn't necessarily have to be testimony. It doesn't necessarily have to be a meeting with a legislator, although that is often the most impactful, but finding a way to plug in and share your story.
Thank you, Jeremy. And that is, just to reiterate, you guys all have, everyone listening has important stories to tell, right? And your stories can have an impact. So to share those stories with those who have the power, right? Those people who have the power to make changes, because that is where they're going to be able to listen, right, to folks. So just like you. This question is directed towards Dana. This is a question relates to intersectionality. So wondering if there are more resources that you would be able to list or share that might be helpful for folks to kind of really understand and get their mind around this intersection of disability and race and gender, and all the things that kind of go into that.
I feel like I could create a syllabus. There's a lot out there. There's a really fantastic book called All the Weight of Our Dreams, Living Racialized Ableism by, I know her name is Autistic Hoya, but I have to remember what her real name is. But if you look for the title, All the Weight of Our Dreams, it's fantastic. There's another one by, actually, I think she's local theorist, Subini Amara, that's also about specifically the intersection of race, disability, and gender. And it looks at school discipline and the school to prison pipeline for girls, especially. Let's see, I'm trying to think of what else is helpful. I think there's also organizations like Open Doors for Multicultural Families that are extremely intersectional in their mission and in their work. And I think sometimes they do some community-based education. That's really helpful. There's a local equity consultant and trainer, Christiana Obe-Sumner, who is an autistic person of color and also does some community education stuff. Families of Color Seattle, I do some training and facilitation with them as well. And we also do trainings on the intersection of race and disability. And those are things that we can bring to a school setting, to communities or to like PTAs or just parent groups that want to learn more, not only about that particular topic, but about how to talk about it with their kids. So those are some good places to start, I think.
Thank you, Dana. You're a wealth of information. And, just a reminder, everybody, that if you missed some of those, we do post this on YouTube. So you can kind of just pause after each of Dana's kind of suggestions there and then be able to write it down.
And I could email a list to y'all if you want to post it with the video, if that would be
cool. Great. I think that, Katrina's, I know, is talking about, we at the Autism Center, we would love to put a blog together following this particular presentation, because there was so much good information. So thanks for that. Ramona, this one is for you. And I think that it's kind of right in your wheelhouse. So, families, how can they, I'm just making sure I've got the right question here. So, what kind of tips that you might have for those out there who are feeling empowered, who are feeling like, I want to advocate, what can they do to advocate for change in Olympia?
Well, I'm going to repeat what everyone else has said, but story, story, story. Make sure people understand these aren't just services. These are people's lives. Do they believe, as a I would start with their values also, as their fundamental value. Do they value everyone? Do they feel that everyone should be able to participate and belong in their community? You get them to buy into what their morals are. And then you go from there. You say, well, okay, I'm so glad you believe that everyone should belong. So here are some things that we can do. But really making sure they understand it's about a life. It's not so much services, it's life. It's someone's ability to participate, to belong, to hold down a job, being able to share what the benefits are. And then also perhaps if you're looking at HUTs, being very honest with them about what the effect is. Usually it's not just an effect on an individual, usually it's going to affect the whole family. And that's important for them to know. Some smaller things and strategies that work with some legislators is that if you're talking about DD supports, there's always a match. So you get a lot more. Like if they're cutting, then they are walking away from money. And that often gets their attention. If they invest a little bit, they can double their investment really easily. And we want them to invest for belonging and everyone having a secure lifestyle. But if they think, oh, I can make my money work more, sure, go for it. That's a small strategy that seemed to work for some people. You probably also need to know realistically that, especially if you're on the west side of the state, they're going to push back and they're going to ask you about revenue. So you need to be thinking about what do you have to say about revenue? Half of the budget is human services is actually a pretty big part of the budget, but a lot of that is federal dollars. Like once you take out federal dollars, it's a much smaller part of the budget, and it's divided up among other types of human services. And a lot of these human services are like Medicaid. DD supports and Medicaid you can cut. Regular Medicaid, Alpha Health, you can't cut. The other type of long-term supports for Medicaid, you can't cut. And then you're getting into things like prisons. A lot of us would like to see disinvestment in the prisons, but is that something they're going to substantially cut like this budget cycle? So it becomes kind of dicey to talk about putting money into DD supports because you're asking them to take money from somewhere else. So a strategy some have there is really challenging them to think about, well, where are you investing now in developmental disabilities? Are you investing money into building structures in the DD community that we need our services? Are you shortchanging provider rates? And so people actually don't have stable care. And by doing that, you're actually triggering more crises, which is more expensive. So you can do strategies like, if you're investing in the front end, you're going to cut down on some extra costs on the back end. But if you're talking about money, you really do have to make your case. Like, why is this investment important? And that's where it comes back to the story, because that's what's going to influence them. It's tug at the heartstring, and it just helps them understand what it is they're choosing to do and why. Story, story, story. And then just having a relationship. Don't just write one letter and assume that that's going to take care of the matter. Write a few letters, make a few cold calls, friend them on Facebook, show up at their town halls. If you are into TDW and you're watching a hearing, send them an email. Let them know that you're watching that hearing. I found that to be very, very effective, is emailing them in real time. Little strategies like that, the connection.
Can I just add something real quick to what Ramona said? What's that?
Yes, please go.
Oh, sorry to catch up, but Ramona, it reminded me that just this morning, our public policy director, Adrian Stewart, who many of you may know, was having a conversation with a legislator who just reminded her that, especially during this virtual legislative session, one of the most powerful things you can do is just signing in pro or con on a bill, which takes, once you're used to doing it, takes literally 30 seconds. You can decide to add a written testimony if you want, but the simple act of clicking pro and your name, and if they see a long list of that can send a really powerful message. So just think about that, just a few seconds.
This is one benefit of the remote session, is that it is way easier to have to be physically on campus during a very specific window frame of what the hearing was, we have to sign in. And now, as long as it's an hour before the hearing starts, you can sign in. And then you can send in written testimony. It is really easy to do as long as you've got internet access.
And I'll just say, Jim, we make it easy for people who want to jump in and just understand what bills might influence or be affecting your child and your community. And if you go to the ARC of Washington website, on our advocacy page, every day right now, but definitely every week, we're updating bills of interest. And there's a very simple chart that has a smiley face, sort of a scratching your head or under review, and a sad face for those bills that we really think shouldn't be promoted. And they're easily digestible. We try to give you a summary and talk a little bit. Our advocacy team is very happy to chat with people about individual bills. And between Ramona and Diana Stadden and Adrian Stewart and many others who are regularly involved in the legislative process, this can be so easy. And especially now in the age of Zoom, I think more and more people are engaged because the geographical barrier and physical barrier of time having to get to Olympia has been eliminated right now. And I don't know that we'll ever fully go back. So once you learn it and figure it out, it's a pretty powerful tool.
Yeah. Thank you, Stacey. You anticipated my follow-up question, which was to, where people might find, when we, raise our collective voices, right, and we're unified in our advocacy efforts, then it increases our power, right, as a community. So so thank you for guessing what I was going to ask next. I've got a question, and I think it relates to families who have had, real struggles during COVID in regards to accessing special education services. Wondering if any of you have recommendations for what families might be able to do to request, compensatory strategy supports or other access to getting some of the services that they just simply haven't gotten. So wondering who might kind of want to step up and just provide some parents and families some ideas about what they might do.
I'm happy to field that one. Document. You need to make sure that you're keeping track of the amount of time that your child is engaged in special education, engaged in their general education classes, and what communications you're having around your child's IEP. We are still in the midst of a pandemic, and every school district is managing this differently. So you have 295 school districts and multiple charter schools and other situations, tribal schools, and every single one of them is handling this differently across the state. So you've got to be a good communicator. And I know this is hard because you're at home with your child trying to deal with remote learning, and keeping track of this is tricky. But it is one of the only ways you'll be able to really request with some confidence the level of compensatory education you may want. Of course, compensatory education is often highly unsatisfying. There are going to be times where you cannot really make up for the loss of educational learning that's happening for some kids. It's not minute for minute, hour for hour. It really is has a different experience for kids with pretty significant developmental disabilities, in particular, kids with autism in particular. Because you can't undo a new behavior that starts. You can't undo some of the trauma that happens with loss of routine and connection to school and timely instruction that neurologically and developmentally is appropriate. And so we know that it's really, it can be very unsatisfying to ask for hour, minute for minute. But if you're willing to do it, there will be a window of time when that starts to come up. It will also be the case that when kids are back in school in person and IEP teams are meeting again, that school districts will have to reevaluate and assess where students are at. And for a lot of families, you'll have the ammunition then to ask for more intensive intervention and additional services if you're good about articulating what's happening.
Thank you, Stacy. Good advice to parents there. So I think we've got time for one last question here. And Ramona, some of the statistics that you shared were, troubling to say, to put it mildly. And this one that we're as Washington State are, 10%, the bottom 10% of states in regards to how DD services are funded. So, and families have limited time, and what can families do? What's the best, most effective way to really make a difference in advocating for how DD services are funded?
I would make the case that the way they're approaching it doesn't make any sense right now. They basically kind of say, well, we'll give $3 million. It's more than $3 million. It's way more than $3 million. But they're just kind of say, we'll just give $3 million and we'll just kind of let them figure out how it's going to be spent. And what you see when you do something like that, you also see this in special education, is that you have not enough money being spread out too thin, and it's very, very highly inequitable. So this session especially, they're saying this is the session they're going to take on equity. It's like, all right, if you're going to take on equity, let's talk about inequity. Like, how are you going to make this more equitable? As long as you're not making any effort to really predict what these costs are. Like, there are gaps in the state where you can't get providers. It's like, why don't we have a cost analysis of what, provider rates should be? Why don't we understand where you do or don't have providers? Why don't we have incentives for certain providers? Why don't we have a special rate for people to help with who have many more complex needs? There's a lot of strategies that they could put in place that would improve services, but they, on their side, they have to start collecting some information. They can't just say blindly, well, we're going to put this much money in the problem, and then we're really not going to look at it. No, they got to be willing to look at it. It's like the people who are on that no paid services list, 14,000, why? What do they want? How long have they been there? The people who currently have services, are they on the right service? Have they asked for residential and they can't get residential? What are they doing about the aging population? You got a lot of very older families. Crisis care, like how many people? What are we talking about here? They're not collecting the data that they need. And so I personally would challenge them and put them on the hot spot and say, you know what, you need to be smart with our money, especially if the legislators push back and say like, well, are you willing to talk about revenue? And then I would push back and say, sure. Are you going to talk about accountability? And are you going to talk about, and go down that line? But, challenge them because they don't know a whole lot about what the unmet need is. And unless you're pushing it on it, all they do is they just fund the people who are currently in the system. They look at who's in the system right now, what services are the people in the system right now need. We're just going to match that. They're not really looking at the fact that, well, the population has increased. Why hasn't the pool increased in line with the population? Or the needs have changed. Why haven't the needs changed? So that would be my advice. Okay. I'm being much more aggressive this year too, by the way. You can be nice to, when you're meeting, you gotta be nice to people. You gotta be appreciative. They want to solve your problem. But at the same time, it's like, come on, you can do better.
Yes.
Our kids deserve better.
You model yourself after Ramona. How about that? Okay, well, we are here at 8:30, and I wanted to thank all of you so much for taking the time out of your night to share this information. So powerful, so inspirational for all of us. And thanks to all of you who were viewing in, and I got to look at the chat, the comments, and lots of good comments, lots of good support for one another. So love to see that as well. We will be back next month. If you've been anxiously waiting for the Autism 200 whole series to be announced, we are busily trying to get that all together, scheduling. It's been a little harder this year during our COVID, but we're going to do it. So we'll be back next month on February 18th, like we always are. So thank you. Good night, and see you soon.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody.